Across much of the world, Greek mythology is rather popular. This sort of makes sense, given ancient Greece established several colonies, and then the Romans, who syncretized their religion with the Greeks, colonized much of Europe, West Asia, and North Africa. The people they colonized would then go on to colonize much of the rest of the world. But beyond just getting to these places, there's an understandable interest to the stories. Greek myths are very action-packed. There's clearly recognizable character tropes and archetypes, many of which the myths themselves helped define. There's an element of intrigue and humor to many of the stories, and many of the stories, though set against the background of Hellenic religion, are not actually religious, and instead follow human characters that have ties to, but are not themselves gods. Now, as these stories have spread so widely, they have inevitably been not only translated, but also adapted. Debate exists as to whether or not stories about other people's gods should be told for profit, and given there are people that observe Hellenic religion today, I understand and appreciate that perspective. I'll be avoiding that controversy today, though, by talking about a completely human character, Andromeda. For those unaware, Andromeda is one of the principal characters within the story of Perseus, Greece's greatest hero prior to Heracles. According to myth, Andromeda was the daughter of Cepheus and Cassiopeia, rulers of ancient Ethiopia. Andromeda was beautiful, and because nobody in Greek mythology knows when to quit, one of her parents bragged about how she was more beautiful than the Nereids, given the Nereids are daughters of Poseidon. Poseidon, or perhaps Ammon, got angry and sent a flood and a sea monster to terrorize Ethiopia. Andromeda's father consults the oracle of Ammon, who tells him he needs to sacrifice his daughter. He tries to. He ties her to rocks, and attempts to let nature take its course. At this time, Perseus, the hero that slew Medusa, finds her, converses with her, and falls in love with her. He defeats the sea monster, and the two marry and live happily ever after until they die, which, at that point, they are then turned into constellations, where they do live happily ever after. If I skipped over anything you think was an important part of the story, there's a good chance it's not something that appeared in every version. Hopefully, though, I covered all of the main points. Now, if you were paying attention, you may have noticed in that very quick synopsis I didn't mention Andromeda actively doing anything. Rather, things are done to her. And for sure, like many women in older art, and sadly even modern art, she is a passive participant within her own story. However, many versions of the story have made it better by giving her agency and perspective. Though the majority of it is now lost to history, the tragedy Andromeda by Euripides was largely from Andromeda's perspective, showing her thought process and emotional state throughout. Various works by Ovid later would also give her more of a personality and a bit more to the romance between her and Perseus, and indeed later still, artists would continue to build upon this personality. Now, if you've seen Andromeda represented in art before, you likely have seen her in damsel poses, though some more tasteful images of her exist from throughout history. Most telling, though, the one true love of ancient Greece's greatest hero, until Heracles again, is depicted, almost always, as white. Strikingly, palefully white, despite being Ethiopian. So you may have heard some people say, well, Ethiopia meant something different back then. It didn't correlate to Ethiopia today. In fact, Ethiopia was more east than it was south, and, well, that's partially right. Ethiopia, as the modern national lines define it, didn't exist, and Ethiopia in the ancient Greek world did not refer to what we now consider Ethiopia. And Homer's description of Ethiopia is that it was the land's furthest east as well as west from Greece. However, the word Ethiopia means the place of the burnt face, with burnt in this context more accurately meaning red and brown in color. Since the time of Homer, Ethiopians were dark-skinned, having reddish and brownish skin tones. Homer, as well as the much later Ovid, described Ethiopians as being further from Greece than Indians, who were, without a doubt, the same Indians we conceptualize today, and as seeing more sun. So, while their understanding of geography was limited compared to today, they conceptualized Ethiopia as a land closer to what we know now as the equator, and the people as being darker skinned than either contemporary Greeks or Indians. Without a doubt, ancient Ethiopia referred to Africa. Further, we see from the histories of Herodotus the perspective of Ethiopia morphed as the myths were being developed. Herodotus, who actually did travel quite a bit, defined Ethiopia as any of the lands south of Egypt. This does include modern Ethiopia, but even if we consider only the nearest parts, this would still mean most Ethiopians would be black, more specifically Nubian. So by the time works like Euripides' Andromeda were being written, Ethiopia definitely meant what we now refer to as Africa to the south of ancient Egypt. Now, there are those that argue the myths of Andromeda take place in Jaffa rather than Ethiopia. While this was a later change, it definitely had its tradition, and I don't mean to deny that to anybody. But even in the traditions that place the events in Jaffa, or as the ancient would be called, Joppa, the characters are still regularly detailed as being Ethiopian, and Joppa being an overseas part of their empire. Some might argue that the later Romans referred to a group of people now translated as white Ethiopians, so perhaps Andromeda was white after all. Ignoring that these references are, 1, inconclusive as to their meaning, and 2, much later in date than the earlier tellings of Andromeda, the contemporary Ovid explicitly and in great detail describes Andromeda's skin tone, and makes it abundantly clear, in terms that are kind of awkward by today's standards, but admittedly are typical ways to talk about women for the time in which he wrote, that she is much darker than Perseus, and her beauty is different than what the Greek is used to, and immensely loved and appreciated. So why, then, was Andromeda repeatedly portrayed as white, despite both her place of origin and the most influential written works about her suggesting or even asserting she wasn't? Well, while we'll never be able to judge anybody's intentions, perhaps, there are plenty of possible reasons. Most generously, it may just have been a case of who was available. Specifically, both in the past and today, models are used by artists to pose for works. Now, given diversity was, though not non-existent, not exactly prevalent in places like Italy and Greece, would it be that outlandish to believe the artist just didn't know what Africans looked like and went with what they did know or could model after? Well, I guess that's a possible explanation for some, but certainly not for all. Consider Piero di Cosimo's painting, with a pale Andromeda but a black musician in her entourage. In fact, even as far back as ancient Greece, like on this vase, we see the servants of Andromeda with black features, but Andromeda herself was mostly portrayed in the same way Greek women were, though admittedly with textured hair and clothing that is used in these vases to signify otherness. Also consider how often Perseus is depicted as darker skinned than Andromeda. Clearly there was not a lack of capability in most cases to depict Andromeda as tradition described. On a more positive note that still kind of goes in that same category, there were also artists that may not have had black models but still attempted to depict the character as Ovid described. Abraham van Diepenbeck, I am so sorry for the horrible pronunciation I am sure, famously drew Andromeda with dark skin. Now, this Andromeda has the facial features and hair you'd expect from a European, but there is explicit proof that the artist was intending to portray her as African. This art was followed by Simon Gribbelin II, and even more expanded by J. Joachim van Sandrart. Again, very sorry. But hey, we can't be sure, right? Maybe it was all just a coincidence that the character associated closely with beauty and love and explicitly described as black just happened to be depicted as white throughout history. Well, I wouldn't buy that anyway. But, as I said, we can't read minds, can we? And so maybe it isn't our place to try to suppose what the motivations were for so many of these artists. Is what I might say if I was silly and also if there weren't these quotes. Vellutello, a commentator for the Italian scholar Petrarch, took Petrarch's telling of the story of Andromeda and added the incongruent but typical jab that, quote, "This man fell in love with Andromeda, daughter of Cepheus, ugly and black as she was," unquote. So on the one hand, you have Ovid, one of the most important Roman poets, saying Andromeda was incredibly beautiful. And then you've got Petrarch, one of the most important Renaissance poets, saying Andromeda is black, and his works being publicly interpreted to say that she was ugly if she was black. Thus, the Renaissance artists, who mostly conformed to the same white-centered standards of beauty, would choose to make the black princess a white one and not consider beauty to be something found in anyone. And nobody makes this clearer than French Renaissance playwright Pierre Corneille. He, too, adapted the story of Andromeda, and likewise noticed that the characters being Ethiopian, in the ancient Greek sense, would most likely mean black or brown. And the reasoning he provides as to why he went with a white cast is perhaps the clearest you can get. Quote, "Moreover, as Ovid does not name the town where he makes this adventure happen, I did not take the courage to name it. He says for all things that Cepheus reigned in Ethiopia, without designating under what climate. The modern topography of these regions is not very well known, and that of the time of Cepheus even less. I will therefore content myself with telling you that Cepheus had to reign in some maritime country, that its capital city should be on the shores of the sea, and that the peoples were white, though Ethiopian. It is not that the blackest Moors do not have their beauty and their fashion, but it is not probable that Perseus, who was Greek and born in Argos, fell in love of Andromeda, if it had been of their complexion. I have for me the consent of all painters. End quote. So, despite Ovid, from whom he admits to be getting most of his inspiration for the story, explicitly saying that yes, the Greek man Perseus fell in love with and found incredibly beautiful the repeatedly described as dark-skinned Ethiopian woman Andromeda, as Corneille himself doesn't find it likely that a white man would love a black woman, he contents himself to say, well, she was probably white. He says he is not willing to step in and make an assumption about where in Ethiopia this story takes place, but he's willing to step in and say, no, Ovid got it wrong. Ovid, who described Andromeda as black and beautiful, got it wrong. And after all, how could I be wrong? All of the painters agree with me. This is one of the reasons why beauty standards are so pernicious. The prejudice of one forms a positive feedback loop. Corneille reads the text by Ovid that describe a black, beautiful Andromeda and decides he can do better. After all, other artists already whitewashed her, so it has to be right. Then, the artists after Corneille, like the filmmakers of both recent Clash of the Titans films, can default back on Corneille's version as a defense. This isn't something that just happened in the ancient and medieval and post-medieval world. It's happening today. The racism of Eurocentric beauty standards is obviously much more dangerous in real life than it is in fiction, but through art we can see how many of those defenses people put up for these standards are untrue. There are those who argue that they just have a personal preference for beauty and don't care if other people find other types of people attractive. If that was the case, there wouldn't be such a concerted effort to say Perseus could only be attracted to white women. There are those that argue beauty standards are more a result of class differences than colorism, but if that was the case, an Ethiopian princess would still be darker than a Greek demigod. There are those that argue that you should just push to say that all people are beautiful. But as we see with Corneille, that is not an idea that you can say and then immediately cancel out white supremacist views of beauty. Andromeda's story is not a perfect one. It's not a feminist one, but it is a memorable one. Like many Greek myths and legends, it continues to be shared and reinterpreted to this day. Rather than let the harmful standards of beauty that have censored and whitewashed this story for millennia due to a racist agenda continue, modern adaptations should seek to correct course and portray Andromeda the way she was originally described. Thank you for listening.